Where we left things was Percy was preparing his ambush. Ah, well, there you go. And now we move on from there, and we go back to Galaway. The good King Willy sat on his throne. His crown was hung over the right arm of the impressive chair, and his left leg over the other. He had a rather perplexed look on his face, which was not unexpected considering the mystery that confronted him and the amount of brandy that he and John had consumed, ostensibly to help them think. Between the external warmth of the roaring fire and the internal warmth of the good brandy, there was scarcely a thought between them. John propped against the mantelpiece in what was meant to be a thoughtful pose. Both men were silent. Thank you, Erndon. Now, there were pages that had been stolen and were missing from the history of the realm from a section I took out. So you should know that. There's pages missing from the book. They had discussed the matter of the missing pages at great length, and had indeed spent the entire day trying to find out what happened. They drew nothing but blanks. They could detect no lies or misinformation from questioning the palace staff, and they were by dinner that evening at a dead end. No leads, no ideas, nothing to go on. Willy's left foot was beginning to fall asleep, and John's breeches were one shade off of beginning to smolder when a great row was heard coming from the chicken coop. Willy sat up straight, and he looked at John. Exactly! Bloody hell! Willy leapt to his feet and immediately fell to his left, barely catching himself on the arm of the throne. John! John! Help me to the window! Pins and needles shot through the king's leg and foot. John's pants, which after a long day had bagged out and had not been touching his skin, made contact when he moved to Willy's aid. With John's help, the king made a rather quick trip to the window overlooking the courtyard. John parked him there and began to politely pick his trousers away from his flesh. The squawking and flapping sounds from the coop amplified. Willy's eyes lit up with righteous anger. Guards! Surround the coop! John had only today trained the guards in this maneuver, since it was something Willy had cooked up after lunch in response to the recent theft. John was a subscriber to the Universal Servants' Code, which clearly states that kings are allowed to do almost anything they want to do. So he followed his instructions and echoed the king's orders in a loud, clear voice. Surround the chicken coop! On cue, firebrands and torches flew in graceful arcs to land on the cobbles in front of the coop. Report! Willy's eyes never left the courtyard. Snipers ready. The voice came from the roof where 10 men stood taut behind their crossbows. Window secure. The voice came from the same level as the throne room, but off to the side. The guards in the courtyard responded with a simple clash of arms. They banged their short swords against their shields and stepped far enough into the court to be seen clearly by the king. Move in. Move in! Cried Willy a second later. John repeated the command. Instantly, the chicken coop was converged on. Not a cockroach could have gotten past the net that now surrounded the coop. And move in they did. Salt of the earth, honest to goodness, real fighting men thrust forth their shields and swords and raided the chicken coop. It was a night to be remembered. There were no casualties. I love that. The tense seconds while the guards were in the chicken house lengthened to minutes. Then a lone figure appeared at the doorway and started to come forward. The archers on the roof tensed, and fingers curled around triggers, each man sensitive of his own weapon's release point. A hand reached out from the shadows and jerked the man backwards. It is to the royal guard's credit that only 2 arrows, and not the entire volley, bounced off the stone of the courtyard. The guard had its orders. No one had given the signal for the all-clear. Anyone leaving the coop before the all-clear signal would be shot. The signal was hastily given and acknowledged. A single soldier entered the torchlight. In his 2 powerful hands he cupped 3 pieces of yellow fluff and held them aloft, presenting them to the king. Willy turned to John with eyes glazed and said, "I'm a daddy again." "Johnny!" hadn't been a servant all his life without learning the basics. He nodded in the affirmative and shook the king's hand. "Congratulations, sire." "Oh, let's visit the little tykes, shall we?" Eugene was pressed against the wall of the northern tower. He was 3 feet from the entrance. Those 3 feet were illuminated by torches lying in the courtyard. Somehow, he had to get back into the tower. He felt like a fox pressed by hounds, like a rabbit surprised by the milkmaid's lantern. He was frozen to the spot. It was all that saved him. When the attention moved to the soldier bearing the chicks, Eugene slipped noiselessly into the entrance. As he trudged doggedly up the stairs, he thought to himself, "So, I wanted an egg? Does that make me a criminal? For crying in the soup, Percy wasn't kidding when he said Willy was serious about his chickens. All I wanted was one little egg." He knew he was lucky to get out with his skin. Eugene entered his chambers and said to the pretty red-haired woman sitting on his bed, "Sorry, love, no eggnog tonight." It was the rag end of the night, the hours between 3 and 5 in the morning, and it was Larry's turn on guard. He had a blanket thrown over his shoulder in an effort to keep off the chill. He threw more wood on the fire and grumbled to himself. He was very sore. His many trips up and down the hill, those made both voluntary and involuntarily, had left their marks on him. He had bruises and scrapes. He had blisters from the rough work. His butt was sore from riding bareback. He was not a happy quester. His unhappiness and his solitude weighed down on him in that lonely hour of the morning, and he began to sob. Cruith's eyes popped open and instantly focused on the figure beside the fire. She nodded silently and squirmed down into her covers. She fell back asleep with a sigh, thinking, "It's true. Everything changes. Everything has been done before, and everything has a price." Larry let his deep sadness come up and wash it away with his Larry let his deep sadness come up and he washed it away with his quiet crying. He hadn't cried like that since his mother died. Nor had he been that close to his feelings since then. It was that bereaved little boy's eyes he wiped when he was done weeping. Something had begun to change in Larry. He'd inadvertently gone back to that point of loss in his life and started over. Without thinking, he set about his morning chores. He put the kettle on the fire and staked the horses on the grass. Breakfast was cooking by the time the others woke. All but Cruith suspected that Larry had hatched some new plot during the night. Cruith could see what had happened. Larry had cried his malice away. Speaking of malice, Percy had left the inn and was on the road by the time the first rays of light had hit the sky. It hadn't been light very long when his horse started up a steep incline. 3/4 of the way up, Percy could see the wagon tracks. He suddenly ran back on themselves and veered off to the side of the hill. He spurred his horse to the break in the bushes and dismounted at the lip of the cliff. Below he could see the broken wagon and the scattered supplies. He looked back to the trail, and he could see the abandoned harness and the leftover goods. Looking further up the hill, he could see the prints left by the horses as the party continued. He looked back at the wagon and said to himself, "Damn! So much for my hitchpin idea." And he mounted his horse and rode on. Eugene was standing at a window in the north tower. In the courtyard below, Willy was out feeding his chickens. As he moved about scattering grain, an occasional ray of light would bounce off his crown, flash through the windows, and hit Eugene. Percy was right, Eugene decided. Willy was a few spokes short of a wagon wheel. Madeline moved up behind him and kissed the back of his neck, her red hair looking something like a coronet in the clear morning light. "What are you staring at, ducks?" she asked, peering around Eugene to see for herself. "That isn't the king, is it?" Though her mouth dropped open in wonder, the expression did nothing to diminish her beauty. Yes, Maddie, I'm afraid it is. The old boy's a little soft under that crown. It's odd, that's for certain, but he does no harm. He's a good king, fair and honest. Eugene remembered his agreement to spread rumors for Percy, and after observing the king, he could almost believe anything about him. So it was with conviction that he said, I don't know about that. I don't think he's all that fair and honest. He's cheating on the test of kings. No, I don't believe it. King Willy cheating? No, I've heard he made that whelp Larry kneel all night and had him gagged and made him a servant of that slave girl. All for show, my dear. He set Larry up with servants and a guard, and that slave girl is to be his, well, yes, to keep him out of trouble for his year and a day. They're off into a hidden resort the king had secretly built in the mountains. Eugene was proud of his little addition of the secret hideaway in the mountains. It rounded out the lie, he felt. Madeline frowned as she watched the king trying to get these 3 little puffs of yellow to eat corn from his hand. Putting it all together that way, it does make sense. Why, that's the rottenest thing I've heard of. Somebody should do something. Well, I've got to be off, love, and open the tavern. See you tonight? Eugene smiled. Of course. Oh, and Maddie, bring some of that roast chicken your place is so famous for. I'll bring you the whole bird, ducks. Larry paid attention to his chores. He was scrubbing the cooking pots clean in a pristine spit of white sand. It was one of the many geological wonders that could be found in the forest of Ballygar. Not 3 paces away gurgled a hot spring. Around its humid warmth grew a plethora of plants, some new moss and some ancient ferns from the times of the great lizards. Larry stacked the clean pots to his right, and his mind swathed in a healing numbness. As he dug down into the sand with a frying pan, he felt it scrape against something metallic. Curiously, he set the pan aside and pushed the sand away with his hands. At the bottom of the shallow pit was a small, flat metal box. It was as long and as wide as his hand, but less than an inch thick. Larry picked it up, and he was about to open it when he heard footsteps on the path behind him. Servitude brings instincts of its own to people, and Larry was no exception. When a servant finds something, he keeps it. A knife, an abandoned belt, or a mysterious metal box. Being owned by another leaves people wanting to keep anything they can. Larry slipped the box under his shirt, just as Dugan's boots crunched on the sand beside him. Got them pots done yet? Almost, said Larry as he dug the frying pan into the sand. Don't be daydreaming, and don't forget to rinse them in the spring. I've no love for sand between my teeth. Dugan turned and trudged back up the path. Larry finished cleaning the pan, gathered the rest, and went to the spring. He bent over the rising steam as he knelt in the soft moss and began dipping the pots in the scalding water. He once again had the frying pan in his hand when the box slipped from his shirt and splashed into the bubbling water. Without thinking, Larry plunged his arm in after it. Ow! He grabbed the box before it had stopped sinking and had it out in an instant. Even so, his arm was badly scalded and the box was already too hot to hold. What happened next took Larry's mind off his burned arm. The metal box seemed to be growing even hotter. He quickly put the box down on the spongy moss. It seemed to settle in as if it had doubled in weight, and then the top popped open. The top popped open. Inside was a flat, teardrop-shaped crystal. The fat end of the drop, a silvery metal, was somehow bound to it. The metal was fashioned into the form of a butterfly. Larry had just reached out to touch the compelling object when the lid snapped shut. He picked up the box, expecting it to still be hot, and was surprised to find that it had already cooled. He put the box back into his shirt, gathered up the pots and pans in his uninjured arm. If later, while Cruith was spreading salve on his burns and bandaged arm, she noticed a strange shape under his shirt, she said nothing. She was not one to muck about with destiny. Larry had never paid much attention to the history of his country, so he didn't know that the box which slapped against his belly all day as he went about his work, well, that it contained the lost artifact. All he knew was that he had found something wonderful, and he was going to keep it. It was more or less a normal day in the forest of Ballygar. The questing party had gotten a late start that morning. Dugan and Elfane had been forced to help Larry load the pack horse. With his arm still bandaged, he could not expect full service from him. Larry did his best. He didn't try to use his injured arm to shirk his duties, and he steadfastly did all that he could with one arm. All of them did everything they could to help. They were deep in the forest of Ballygar now, and almost everyone felt the need to stick together. They traveled straight through in the early afternoon before they stopped to let the horses drink at a convenient stream and to replenish themselves. Larry took his ration of jerky and returned to the horses. He watched them drink and then let them out onto a grassy embankment to graze. The rest of the party gathered around Elfane and his map. They all munched on the tough jerky and breathed down his neck while he was calculating their position. Finally, after much counting on his fingers and many ciphers in the margins, Elfane announced them to be only 3 miles from the dread Grey Goose Hills. The men slapped each other's backs in celebration, and the women drew aside. "I think we should stay the night right where we are," said Cruith to Brishee once they got away from the rest. "We've got daylight left. Why not move on?" Brishee wanted to know. "Because once we get to the Grey Goose Hills, confusion sets in, and magics, both big and small, become almost impossible to perform." "Magics? What magics?" "It's my idea, fair Brishee, to conjure a storm that will blow the fog away from the hills, so that we can truly find out what happened." "How long can you make the fog stay away?" "Well, long enough to take a bearing on which way Monaghan went. Beyond that, I can make no guarantees." "What will you need for your spell?" "I need a fire with at least 2 gallons of water boiling over it. I need a tent or an enclosure of some sort to be built. It has to be large enough for 2 grown people to lay down inside. And I need your promise." "My promise? Promise of what?" "Your promise to not give up this quest until you fulfilled the king's bidding." "Why would I give it up?" "I think you're going to find more dangers in the forest of Ballygar and the Grey Goose Hills than you ever expected to experience in your life." "I promise, Cruith." "One more thing." "Yes, whatever you want. I trust you." "Tonight during your watch—" "Yes, I have the watch from midnight till 3. What do you want?" "Pay no attention to who or what you see. What happens tonight never happened." "Anything else?" "That'll do, dearie-o. That'll do." Percy had sweated and strained, piling up rocks for as long as he dared. He had cut down a green tree, and from that cut a 10-foot section that averaged about 4 inches in diameter. Moving one more rock to serve as a fulcrum, he had wedged one end of his cut pole under the pile of rocks. Now he waited. Looking down the trail that he had traveled the night before, he counted the minutes until the party would ride into his trap. His ambush was simple. The track they would follow was a narrow gully between 2 steep and rocky hills. On one hill, Percy had pulled down a dead tree, using a rope and the power of his horse. Yeah, don't we all? He had then rolled the snag to the bottom of the gully, blocking the trail. On the other hill, he had made his pile of rocks. The plan was simple and brutal. The party would stop at the fallen tree, and when they were assembled in the process of cutting through the tree, Percy would roll the rocks down on them. Being trapped between the steep walls of the gully, the party would die, or at least make for easy killing. He would ride back to the palace, switch places with Eugene, and the next day at court he would volunteer to check up on the questing party. He'd ride to the inn, spend a couple of days, and then ride back to the castle with the horrible news. Simple, effective, but lacking one element: the questing party. Percy checked the position of the sun. They really should be coming soon. He sat down on the breezy ridge top and ate from his saddlebags. From where he sat, he could see the seething fog of the Grey Goose Hills. Even though the sun warmed his back, he shivered as if he were within the cold, damp folds of the fog. He pulled his eyes back around to the sunny scene around him, glad that he would never have to enter that grey tract of light-forsaken land. Oh, yes. Not only is Percy bad news, Percy's going to become worse news. Percy was getting impatient. He flung the remains of his lunch into the wind, and the wind blew them back into his face. The chicken bones landed in his lap. The neck was crossed by a broken wing. Irritated, Percy stood up and let the bones fall from his lap. He didn't notice that the symbol repeated itself on the ground, the neck crossed by the broken wing. The wind swirled around the open ridgetop. Percy looked up at the sky, praying for fair weather, but it was already changing. Above were high, thin clouds that refracted the sunlight into a sheet of white illumination. He looked around at the landscape. There were no shadows. Everything was lit from all sides. Percy shivered before he really knew what he was doing. He had thrown his saddlebags over his shoulder and was following the ridge as it paralleled the trail. He thought briefly of going back for his horse, but decided against it. His footprints in the dry dirt were swept away by the swirling wind. The air that forced its way inside him tasted coppery, like mush at the bottom of the cauldron. "More wood on that fire!" shouted Cruith. She was sitting on a wool rug woven in a strange design. Larry dropped another bundle of wood and began to feed the blaze. His arm was quickly healing. It occurred to Cruith that perhaps all of Larry was healing quickly. Oh, well, she thought, you make your magic and you take your chances. Elfane thought Dugan was acting strangely. The warrior was pacing the perimeter of the camp while Elfane worked putting together Cruith's shelter. Since there were many cedar trees around them, Elfane had been gathering their boughs. They wove together easily to form a round hut. From cutting the branches which flowed freely with fragrant sap, the twisting of them into the weave of the structure, well, enough fine cedar scent was released to flavor the whole camp. The wonderful, clean smell seemed to calm everyone. Everyone but Dugan. Elfane watched the big man pace. As he walked, Dugan reached out with his hand and stretched. He flexed his shoulders and strained his fingers outward until they were white with tension. Then he would relax, turn on his heel, and repeat the exercise. Elfane finished up his construction by hanging a piece of holly on the center of the hut. Then he moved to intercept Dugan in his circuit. Cruith nodded to Elfane in passing and crawled into the hut, dragging a leather bag behind her. "Dugan, what is it? What's bothering you?" Dugan snapped out of his preoccupation. Oh, Elfane, nothing. Nothing for you to be concerned about, lad." Elfane drew himself up to his full height, which brought him up to Dugan's meaty shoulder. "I don't want to have to remind you, Dugan, that I am second in command of this mission. If I ask what's wrong, I want to know what's wrong." "Indeed, sir?" Dugan looked off somewhere past Elfane's left ear and said, "Indeed. It is an old soldier's superstition that you always feel horny the night before you die. For some people it leads to suicide, but I found in my later years that the feeling always precedes a time of imminent peril. And tonight..." Here Dugan filled his chest mightily and shifted his gaze just past Elfane's right ear. "Tonight, I feel like a bear that's just awakened from his 6-month slumber and woke up, well, horny." Dugan finished by looking Elfane straight in the eye. "Carry on, soldier." Elfane walked directly back to his maps and rechecked his calculations. Dugan shook his head, thinking, "Oh, you can't hide forever in your books, lad." Brishee could hear Cruith chanting inside the hut, but as she walked past. Brishee had been tending the horses. Larry, with his burned arm, was better off gathering wood for Cruith's spell. Brishee felt like she was late, as if she had missed something. One of the horses, Ross, had given her a bunch of trouble. He obviously didn't want to be tied up for the night. Ross had pulled against his tether, and his eyes had rolled back into his head in a way. It was fortunate that Brishee was handling the animals that evening. She had calmed Ross, and thereby settled the rest of the herd. She had talked to Ross, crooning him into a conditional peace. Now, as she walked across her camp, she tried to put together what she'd missed. Cruith was chanting in her hut. Good. The spell was being cast. The clerk, Elfane, was at his papers again. Good. She wouldn't have to talk to him for a while. Dugan was self-involved and strutting back and forth on the edge of the cedar trees. Larry was feeding the fire from the substantial pile of wood he'd gathered. There was nothing left for her to do but find a solitary place to think. She set off to the east and soon saw the rising moon. The moon was more than full. It was heavy. It was so full it looked ready to pop, orange and huge. Its light topped the trees and left the ground in harsh relief. Brishee felt the edge of her freedom, that sharp cut between thinking that you can do for yourself and actually doing for yourself. Suddenly, Brishee had to decide when others slept and ate and did their chores. She had gone in a few short days from servitude to mistress, from being a goat slave to commander of a quest. She breathed deeply of the kinetic air and felt the motion of the trees around her. Standing there in the cold wind, Brishee felt comforted. She had rinsed clean her stain of slavery and was reflecting back on her childhood. She recalled a complete sense of security and love. Her parents were vague shadows in her mind, but the feeling she got from them was fine air to sail on. The wind picked up an oak leaf and it fluttered in front of her face. Instinctively, she grabbed it and crushed it under her nose. Grinding the leaf between her palms, she let it go onto the currents of air that swirled around her. The updraft spiraled past her into the woods. Brishee felt clean and able. Having met many shamans and priestesses along the caravan route, she was not in doubt that Cruith could conjure something. She just didn't know what. For she did know in her bones that things were well with her expedition. She bowed to the goddess of the moon and returned to her responsibilities in the camp. John knocked at Percy's chamber door. There was a shuffle of feet and the door opened. John's first impression was that Percy was ill. Then he realized Percy smelled of wine. And Percy was obviously shocked to see him. Good afternoon, sir. Hi, John. Eugene stood in the doorway. May I come in? Sure, but the place is a mess. Well, that's why I'm here. It seems that unless I keep up with them, the cleaning staff tends to neglect your quarters, said John as he walked into the room. I sent them away this morning. I didn't feel like being interrupted. It's not their fault. John took note of the empty wine bottles and chicken bones with a lift of his eyebrow. He stood with his back to the window and asked, Is there a more convenient time when they could come to clean? John's eye caught sight of a lacy woman's underthing on the floor beside the bed. Oh, well, I suppose Eugene was doing his best to think fast. I should be going out this afternoon. Why don't you send them up then? But of course, sir. Do you require anything else? No, thank you. And thank you for your concern. I'm sure you have many duties you need to attend to. Eugene was gesturing toward the door when a loud rabble of voices sounded from the courtyard. Both men went to the window and looked out. Below were 20 or 30 people collecting on the flat paving stones. They were confronting Willy, who had been going over plans with his master carpenter for his new chicken coop. The voices sounded angry and insistent. Guards were rushing to the scene, and Willy was holding up his arms to signal the crowd to be quiet. I'd best get down there, said John. I'm coming too. Very well, sir, but might I suggest that you put on some trousers? John left and clattered down the stairs. To himself, Eugene thought, I have to start paying more attention. The air in the courtyard seemed compressed. It weighed heavy in the lungs of the crowd. By the time John reached the scene, the king was flanked by his guard, and one man from the group had been delegated to speak. It was Tully, the butcher. Tully was searching his sketchy vocabulary for words that would get his point across without insulting the king. Well, my lord, we've come here because we have it on good authority that, we've heard that your son, that Prince Larry is... Here the king interrupted. He's not a prince for his year and a day. Yes, sire, we know that, but, you, or rather he is... John broke in when Tully hesitated. Sometimes the king was too patient. Out with it, man. What have you to say to the king? Larry is cheating on the test of kings, Tully blurted out. The crowd behind him roared with affirmation. Eugene reached the gathering just in time to hear this. He wished with all his heart he'd stayed in the tower. Damn! What had Percy gotten him into now? Willy was stunned. He had come up with what he thought was a good solution to the problems of his son, sending him out to succeed or fail on his own merits, and now there were accusations of cheating. You sent him off to a villa in the mountains with servants and fine food and a slave girl to keep him, occupied. Where did you hear this? Roared John. He felt the quickest way to clear this up was to find the original accuser. Maddie stepped forward from the crowd and curtsied. We mean no offense, sire, but you must admit that it seems very strange. Perhaps you could just answer our question? Our minds would be at rest and these rumors would stop. Eugene was horrified. What would he do if Maddie said the accusations came from him? He had never been as slick as Percy when it came to talking his way out of something, and that damn servant John was already looking at him with like he was, a cockroach in soup. All the wine and women in the world were not worth what might happen to him if he were found out. Willy, always fair to his people, said calmly, Ask your questions. Maddie nodded and asked, Who is this slave girl, Brishee, and where did she come from, and why did you make her leader of the quest? I simply decided to make the next beggar through the door the leader of the quest. I had no idea who was next in line. She had escaped her master just the day before. As you know, it's our policy to help escaped slaves. It all sounded perfectly reasonable to Willy. Well, who was her master? I heard nothing of some trader losing his slave. The crowd rumbled at this. Indeed, no one had heard the goat trader complain. The trader had rounded up his stock after the explosion in the market, made a deal with Tully for the whole bunch, and left town with plans to get out of the goat business forever. I don't know, Willy answered honestly. Again, the crowd rumbled. Didn't you send one of your palace guards to protect him? Dugan was sent to protect all of them. Cries of, I knew it, and now he's sidestepping, came from the back of the mob. We've heard, sire, Maddie went on when they had quieted down, that they left with some of the finest food and grog from your stores. Is that true? Willy turned to John. He had no idea what they had taken with them. John took a step toward the crowd. They took provisions for the trip. Damn fine provisions, we heard. Again from the back, no face identified with the accusation. Then a man who should have been tending to his cobbler's shop instead of harassing the king came to the front. Wasn't it your son, the prince's personal servant? Wasn't he sent along? Willy replied at once. He was sent along as historian and second in command. The statement was answered with laughter and cries of, oh, indeed, yeah, quite a step up for a boot polisher. John shouted his signal to the guards, and they shouted for silence. When the mob quieted, Willy answered in a voice made harsh by his anger. We have always been fair with the test of kings. None of my line have ever cheated on the test. I challenge any one of you to bring me evidence of any kind that proves these accusations. The mob suddenly became a gathering of individuals who did not want to fall directly under their monarch's gaze. It's one thing to yell from the back of a mob, quite another to be singled out as a prosecutor of royalty. Everyone was shocked when Maddie stepped forward and knelt before the king. I accept your challenge, my lord. Very well. Bring me proof of this cheating of his, and I will reward you with 700 pieces of gold. Now, the entire crowd suddenly wanted in on the act. The king raised his hand against the shouts of, I'll go too! I'll bring you proof! I've made my offer to this woman. The rest of you will have to be satisfied with the evidence she brings. Now disperse. My son will pass or fail the test on the same grounds as myself and his ancestors. Never! And his voice shook, and those gathered around could sense the royal anger. Never let it be said that one of my line was not fair and honest in all things, including the test of kings. Now disperse! The king's guard came forward, and the crowd left. Not a grumble was heard until they were all well outside the gates. Maddie rose slowly and winked at Eugene. Only John caught the silent communication. The king stalked off with his carpenter, and they went back to their plans. Eugene tried to think himself invisible as he made his way back to the tower. Soon it was only John left in the courtyard. He had a puzzled look on his face. Maddie closed up her tavern and left that afternoon. The capital city would have to live without the feathered pig for a while. She felt confident she had done what Percy had wanted her to do. If she played her hands wisely, she could have rewards from both the king and Percy. She had planned to ride all night, but was forced to stop in the shelter of a stand of pines by a fierce storm that just seemed to blow in from nowhere. In the cedar grove, Cruith's cauldron boiled, and the steam from it billowed around her face. She sniffed at the brew and nodded. Turning to the rest, she said, Keep the fire under it and don't add any more water. Then she went back into her hut and resumed her chanting. Elfane added more wood to the blaze from the substantial pile Larry had gathered. The night was turning cold, and distant rumblings could be heard from the north. Dugan was still pacing in and out of the shadows created by the roaring fire. Small, ragged clouds passed over the face of the moon, as if they were late getting somewhere. Larry was wound up in his blanket with a beatific smile on his sleeping face. Brishee came to the fire and sat beside Elfane. Do you think this will work? I really don't know, replied Brishee. I've seen many a conjuring in my life, but I've never seen a storm conjured. If the fog is as thick as they say, it may be our only hope. Oh, I don't like it. I mean, don't get me wrong. If it works, I'm sure it will be a great help. It's just that... What? I've never seen anything conjured, and I find it unsettling. And there are other things that disturb me. Really? Like what? To Brishee's surprise, she was genuinely interested in Elfane's ideas. His shyness confused her, but... Well, she was not used to men who didn't try and dominate. Elfane spoke to her as a person, not as a man speaking down to a woman. It made her curious about him and his feelings. He was somehow new to her. What else bothers you? Elfane nodded toward the sleeping Larry. He's been different the last couple of days. I've known Larry all my life, and I can tell when he's pulling an act to get something. In the last day or so, he's been so nice. Now, either his acting has improved, or he's sincere, and to tell you the truth, I really can't give credit to either possibility. Brishee spoke without thinking, her eyes fixed on the cauldron. I've a feeling we are bound to see many strange things before our mission is done. Dugan suddenly marched past them, looking neither right nor left, his eyes fixed straight ahead with a measured tread. He passed by the fire, and he ducked into Cruith's cedar hut. At that moment, the pot on the fire boiled dry, and the magic herbs, bits of feather, eggshells, and hair, and other oddities Cruith had added to her brew began to smoke as the water went out of them. The smoke twisted up from the pot in a spiral, looking for all the world like a small tornado. The funnel thickened as if it was gathering strength and shot up into the black sky. The murder of crows that was at roost in the grove gave voice to a tremendous squawking, "Ah!" And then, as if on cue, they all fell silent. At that instant, the storm hit. Brishee and Elfane huddled under a blanket and threw more wood on the fire, hoping that the size of the blaze would fight the wind and rain that threatened to extinguish it. Larry slept on. Incredibly, the storm seemed to have left his little corner of the camp alone. The artifact was now in a pouch around his neck. It rested on his chest, over his heart, and sent out quiet, healing waves of love and warmth. Elfane had been correct. Larry was changing. Part of it was his doing, and part of it was the influence of the crystal artifact. Against all odds, Larry was becoming a human being. The wind whipped tree branches, lashing Percy in the face. The sleet and rain chilled him to the bone. The dark was confusing and dangerous. He'd fallen several times. Once he'd stumbled at the top of a rise and had rolled all the way to the bottom, fetching up in a muddy creek that was thick with the runoff from the storm. Bruised, wet, shaking, he went on in search of the questing party's camp. He had all but given up when he smelled the smoke of their fire. He pushed on into the outer rim of the cedar grove, masked by the thick growth that he spied on the camp. The light of the sputtering fire didn't give him much opportunity to see what was going on. He strained his eyes and made out the shape of the hut and the huddled figures beside the fire. Percy had been so single-minded in finding the party that he hadn't any thought as to what to do when he found them. Standing there, shivering in the rain, he wished wholeheartedly he'd stayed with his horse and had simply holed up and waited for them at his ambush point. A sudden shift of the roaring wind took the scent to the horses. The saddlebags he'd managed to cling to despite his tumbles still contained the smell of his mare, and Ross, the stallion, who had been quieted early by Brishee, snorted and stamped, thinking that perhaps there was a lady-love near. He whined loudly and let her know his location. He reared, trying to break loose from his tether. Brishee and Elfane let go of their soggy blanket and ran to the picket that held the horses. In the blinding storm, with mud underfoot, it took both of them to hold Ross against his amorous instincts. The other horses were now spooking, and it seemed that they might lose them all. Again the wind shifted, bringing the billowing smoke from the fire into Ross's nostrils and washing the scent of the invisible mare away. Ross quieted. Brishee and Elfane put his edginess down to the weather, and after checking all the halters and the security of the picket line, returned to try and build up the fire. Percy turned and began to make his way back to the pile of rocks on the gully wall, not sure why he had come. Even though it took hours for him to get back to the gully, he didn't know why he'd set out the night before. The storm eased with the coming of daylight, and the sky cleared. Percy at first wasn't sure he'd found his way back to the correct spot or not. Something was different. He shook his head to clear away the exhaustion and realized what had happened. The rain had washed the soil out from underneath his pile of rocks, and they now lay on the bottom of the gully. Instead of a dead ambush, they now formed a bridge over the broken tree he had placed there as an obstacle. Percy ranted and fumed, but he knew that he didn't have time to reset his trap before the party arrived. As his rage was spent, he became aware of two other factors. First, when he looked to the Grey Goose Hills, he noticed the absence of fog. And looking around, he noticed something else. The absence of his horse. Percy was overcome. His mare's tracks led off into the hills. Percy set off in the bright sunlight after his mount. The man who would be king was bruised and scraped, but not broken. He slogged on. His mind was already working on another plan. If the party could not be taken from the outside with a physical ambush, perhaps he could arrange their demise from within their own ranks. The thought of deception cheered him. Although tired and battered, Percy's evil and the wild freedom it represented gave him the strength to forge ahead. Cruith was out early and kneeling on the exact center of the cedar grove. Once again, Charlie's head occupied the top of the circle, and his bones were being tossed. The pink of the dawn winked down on Cruith's circle in the dirt. Everybody else was asleep, and Cruith, too preoccupied to give proper attention to her turn at watch. Not that there was any danger. The powers that had gathered over the spot during the night were more than enough to keep harm at bay. Cruith studied the bones. Again, there was the inverted breast. The influence of a traitor was still being felt. Another toss. The unbroken wishbone across the thigh. Brishee's virginity still intact and important. Yet another toss. Wings landed in symmetry across an upright breast. A change of heart was coming to someone. And the neck bones landed hooked over the thigh bone. Someone was coming to them. Cruith grunted and sat back on her haunches. Larry stirred and rolled out of his bed. Shaking the sleep from his head, he immediately got up and started his morning chores. At the same time, Brishee stood for blankets and started around, looking around the camp. Cruith gathered Charlie's bones in her pocket and wondered, change of heart. Change of heart? For whom? Dugan crawled bleary-eyed from the hut, while he was still in the entrance he stood. His wide shoulders caught the entrance and dislodged it. The whole structure came tumbling down. Dugan looked confused and then saw Cruith across the way. He strode purposely toward her, trailing cedar boughs as he went. When he got to within a foot of her, he stopped. He stood tall, she still kneeling in the duff of the cedars. He looked down on her. She smiled up at him. "Well, at least you're bushy-tailed." Cruith chuckled, referring to the branches that still hung to Dugan. Dugan fought for his honor. I was beguiled. If that's what you want to call it, Doogies. I had no idea of what I was doing. Well, that's too bad. Do you mean you can't repeat it? I must see to the camp. As he trudged away, Cruith said to his retreating back, "I fear it's much the same as you left it." A scream pierced the sweet, clean air. Everyone ran toward the sound and surrounded Elfane. He was on his hands and knees, picking through some kind of paste strewn about on the muddy ground. "What's wrong?" asked Brishee, the fastest and therefore the first at his side. "My maps!" wailed Elfane. They're ruined." It took a minute for them all to realize that the thin paste running through Elfane's fingers were the maps and the text that they all replied upon, and they had been ruined by the storm. "What will we do now?" asked Elfane, his voice full of anguish. "We follow our noses to the Grey Goose Hills," replied Cruith. "After that, your maps are of no use anyway." "If there's a fact in history that's important, we'll just have to rely on you remembering it." The party packed and departed in silence. They set out on the only trail to the Grey Goose Hills. Speed was important if they wanted to get there before the fog returned. The storm had passed Maddie earlier in the night. The storm had passed Maddie earlier in the night. Walking into the clear air and stars overhead, Maddie had remounted and pursued the trail. She rode like a demon. She even surprised herself. By late morning, she had traded her winded horse for a fresh mount at the inn, and by early afternoon, she was examining the wagon tracks leading off the cliff to the wreckage at the bottom. Maddie took the fair weather as a sign and pressed on into the lengthening shadows of dust. We're probably going to go a bit past the hour. I realize that some folks can't stay, but probably going to go to at least 10 after to get close to where I need to be. So hang in there, have a piece of cheese, get a bit of mead or some wine, and we'll push on. Percy swallowed hard. He was standing at the edge of the wood. It marked the boundary of the Grey Goose Hills. Something intangible held him there at the border. He could see tracks left by his horse as it ran into the storm deep into the slimy confines of the hill. He strained against what felt like an invisible barrier. He could plainly see the horse's hoofprints, but he couldn't seem to follow. No amount of willpower, no matter how much he mustered, would enable him to enter the wood. Percy drew back in the lee of a great boulder. He panted and he watched. Something fundamental in Percy froze at the prospect of entering the Grey Goose Hills. He could go no further until some other human made a path. Percy spent several hours of painful self-realization before the party arrived and he could follow. Getting the throne was turning out to be quite a project. Maddie rode on into the late morning and so entered the forest of Ballygar. She and her exhausted mount stumbled across the former campsite of the questing party. There was a fire ring made of gathered stones. Slightly to the north was green grass and wild oats for her horse. A trail led through the underbrush to the east, where a humid scent of the air beckoned her. She spent scant moments making sure her horse was provided for, and then she went off in search of the healing aromas. Maddie found herself standing in the fine white sand Larry had used for a dish sink. She spied the spring. She instantly rushed over and inhaled the steaming vapors rising from it. Keeping her eyes shut, she filled her lungs with the forgiving vapors. With her ear, she followed the sound of the gurgling spring down the hill. Exactly on the edge of her hearing was what sounded like the splash of a stream into a pool. Again she inhaled and then opened her eyes. She followed the water. She hit a spot infested with blackberries. The stream still ran hot and straight beside her. She plowed through the thorns. The bushes seemed to pick at every thread of her. The blackberries gave way to leafy ferns, and she sank ankle-deep in soft green moss. The stream fell some 3 feet into a pool, deep and lined with smooth, water-worn rock. The water gave off little steam. It was by now cool enough to bathe in. Maddie didn't even break her stride as she slid out of her traveling clothes and into the warm mineral water. What more could a gal ask for after riding 30 hours straight? Maddie went pretty much right to heaven. The minerals in the water mixed with her essence, and she softened. The worries about the tavern fell away. Concerns over political situations she found herself embroiled in leached out of her. For once, she was just plain Maddie, asleep on a cloud, wrapped in a dream, a goddess in a teapot. I like that. The rock slide slowed the party's progress. The horses had to be led one by one across the stony impediment. Larry, his arm almost completely healed, did most of the work coaxing the horses across. When the last animal was on the far side of the slide, they remounted and were soon at the edge of the Grey Goose Hills. Elfane was ecstatic. Finally, after all these years of reading the histories, he was at Monaghan's last known camp. He prowled around, not really expecting to find any clues overlooked by the first search party, but just to get the feel of the place, to try and reconcile his book knowledge with what now was before his very eyes. To the rest, he appeared to be running around like an excited puppy. And they were not that far from wrong. "The fog won't stay away forever, Brishee," warned Cruith. Brishee looked to the distant hills where already the ghastly grayness was creeping back over the landscape. The way ahead did not look pleasant. The trees were covered with long strands of gray moss. This odd plant life dripped moisture continually. The trees themselves were dark and slick with wetness, and under the trees was slimy gray mud of a sort that looked like the kind that sucked off your shoes when you stepped in it. Not stepping in it didn't seem to be an option, since it lay as far as anyone could see into the hills. Brishee bent to examine the goop. "What is this stuff?" Cruith laughed. That's one of the reasons they're called the Grey Goose Hills. Have you ever kept geese? One of the caravans I was owned by had some, yes. Well, then, what you're stepping in is then a lot like what you're going to be, what you were stepping in then is a lot like what you're going to be walking in for the next day or so. Although it is not really goose shit. Actually, it comes from the moss in the trees. Although it sure smells like it. It looks like it and it feels like it. Good news is, well, it doesn't go on forever. Oh, thank heaven for that. Yeah, the bad news is it gets a lot deeper before we get out of it. Brishee, Dugan called from a ways away. I found something. Everyone rushed to where the soldier stood, staring at the ground. He was pointing to a set of hoof prints leading away through the muck. Somebody's been here before us, was his considered opinion. Not necessarily, said Cruith. Well, see for yourself. The horse was shod. You can see the prints of its shoes. Yeah, but no one was riding it, Cruith argued. See how it lost its footing over there? She pointed to some evidence of a horse skidding down the hill. I tell you, that stuff is so slippery that all creatures have to go on their own feet. A horse with a rider would have fallen 15 times trying to go down this one hill. The horse had no rider, and no one was leading it. It was alone. Why would a horse be out here alone? Asked Elfane, peering at the desolate landscape. Maybe it was on holiday? Snapped Cruith. Dugan looked around uneasily. It had to have a rider, and now that rider and horse are separated. He must be somewhere behind us. I fear we are not alone on this quest. Then we must push on. Brishee's tone was firm. When we get to the other side of the muck and can ride again, we'll lose him quick enough. Which way do we go, Cruith? Cruith pointed to a high peak that was, even as they stood there, redawning its shroud of fog. We need to head for that mountain. It's Mount Meath. On the east slope, there's a village of sorts. We can get supplies and information there. Well, how do you know? Elfane's voice was questioning and suspicious. Oh, didn't we tell you? Brishee's voice was all innocence. Cruith used to live there. Is there anything else that you two know that I don't? Oh, a fair amount, I'd say, replied Cruith. This brought laughter from all but Elfane, as they formed up in a single line and entered the goo. Dugan went first, leading his horse, then Brishee walking in front of her mount. Elfane followed her, then Cruith, with Larry bringing up the rear. Larry had tied Ross's halter to the pack horse load and led the pack animal. This made Ross the very last in line. When he entered the muck containing the mare's prints, he stopped and snorted. And then he jerked his head up, as he had, for an instant, caught a whiff of the wind of her scent again. It came not from the prince, but through the air. Larry got the pack horse back in motion, and Ross stumbled reluctantly after him. They had only gone a few yards into the goo when Elfane's shout brought the column to a halt. Look! There, on that tree, he yelled, and all turned their eyes to where he pointed. Hacked into the tree was a mark. Old and nearly obliterated by time was an M. It was obviously made by a sword and done in a hurry. They had no doubt it was left by Monaghan, or that the searching party sent by King Clare could not have possibly seen it if the fog were present. For the first time they knew they were onto something, and they were onto something more than what was revealed in the histories. Percy peeked out from behind the shelter of his boulder. He watched the party disappear into the valley, and he sat down again and focused on his will of being king. It was something about the slime and the muck that was almost impossible for him to face. It's not easy to stroll across the reflection of one's own soul, especially when the image is as revolting as the goo of the Grey Goose Hills. He sat there a full hour before he had the courage to follow. He'd only gone 10 paces when he slipped and fell for the first of many times. It wasn't long before he was covered in the sticky stuff. Soon, only his round, white eyes marked him for a human and not some monster that had risen out of the muck. The questing party slogged on through the muck. In accordance with Cruith's predictions, the muck had gotten deeper. Waist deep, in fact. The party plowed doggedly through the disgusting stuff. Oh, I don't know. We'll have to find out. The stench was overpowering. A member of the traveling team stopping to toss their contents of their stomach was not an uncommon event. As they went down the hillside, the muck got deeper. By the time they crossed a ravine and groped their way to the top of another ridge, they would be submerged to their necks, at times forced to swim. At the top of one ridge they stopped. Here the goo was only ankle deep, and there was a slight breeze. No one felt like eating, although it had been an exhausting process most of the day. Cruith pointed to the next ridge. "The slime ends on the other side of that hill. After that we'll be able to ride, but the fog will be back and we won't be able to see." Great. Dugan was in the lead as they started down the hill into the deepening goo. He lost his footing and his grip on his horse. He was submerged, gone from sight, until he fought his way to the surface at the bottom of the ravine. Brishee led Dugan's horse along with her own to the bottom, where he was trying to get the goo off his face. Cruith found him and a bit of clean cloth, and he grunted his thanks. They were just getting underway when a slight hissing sound could be heard. "Slime snakes!" shouted Cruith. Dugan groped for his sword while he was trying to keep his mouth out of the muck. When at last he found it and he drew it, he asked, What the bloody hell are slime snakes?" "They're coming right for us." Cruith was pointing down the ravine to where what looked like a rhinoceros horn was plowing slow but powerful S's toward them. Dugan had just enough time to slog a few steps toward the snake before it reared up and its whole head could be seen. The horn was located forward on the snout of a large reptilian face, crowned by a floppy coxcomb made of outside scales. It had nose flaps over its nostrils, no doubt to keep out the muck. The snake's eyes were guarded by 3 sets of eyelids, including one set that blinked vertically. When the last set of eyelids opened, like the last curtain of a passion play, huge blood-red eyes with tiny black pupils were revealed. Dugan took a stance, trying for the best footing that he could get, and gripped his sword with both hands. He was standing on tiptoe, doing his best to keep his head and shoulders above the muck. The fact that he didn't flinch when the creature opened its jaws is a testament to the man's courage. Its mouth was filled with glistening yellow teeth. Dugan parried and feinted, tried to fence with the monster as it writhed above him. He led the deadly thing to his left with deft swiftness, brought a blow that severed the head from the rest of the vile body. The slime snake's head lay in the muck. Jaws still snapping, its slow reptilian nerves not recognizing the fact that it was actually dead. Likewise, its body thrashed. Even 20 paces away, the muck roiled as the snake spent its last death throes. "That's a slime snake," said Cruith, finally answering Dugan's question. "Why didn't you tell us about these monsters?" What little that could be seen of Dugan was white and shaking. "Would you have believed me?" countered Cruith. "That is a point," conceded Dugan. "Let's get the hell out of this slop." "Quiet!" shouted Brishee. I thought I heard another, but her warning was transformed into a scream as another massive horn rose in front of her. The snake had slipped between her widespread legs in the goo, and as it reared up, it took her with it. Brishee dropped her sword and grabbed its horn. Riding like an unbroken horse, she avoided falling beneath its hissing jaws. She clung to the monster as it fought to shake loose its burden. Dugan made his way quickly as he could through the neck-high muck in an attempt to come to Brishee's aid. Just as he heard the beast, he slipped and went below the surface. Elfane fought forward past the panicked horses, only to find that he couldn't strike without risking injury to Brishee. The snake seemed focused on him. Elfane dodged and parried and kept the thing's head above him in a deadly dance. The snake, with carnivorous ambition, simply wanted to dive into the slime and devour Dugan, but Elfane was in its way. Its tongue flicked wildly, smelling meat all around it. Carnivores. The jaws gaped open as it perceived the smothering warriors struggling to the top. Suddenly the snake twisted back on itself and shrieked in pain. Larry, on finding a loop of the creature's body beside him, had begun to hack at it with his dagger. Elfane made use of the distraction to snag Brishee's foot and haul her off the monster's head. She landed in the muck again, knocking Dugan off his feet. The snake brought its fearsome head around, associating its pain with the warm bodies in front of it. Elfane drove the point of the sword up under the monster's jaw. Such was the force of the thrust that the sword traveled through the snake's brain and popped out the top of its head. The screaming went on until Dugan, having regained the surface, pushed through the muck to its side and with a calculated swing cut the thing's head off. They spent no time congratulating themselves. Pausing just long enough to retrieve their weapons, they climbed the rest of the way to the top of the ridge. At the top they found the end of the muck and the beginning of the fog. "Was anybody cut or bitten by that thing?" Cruith asked. Everyone answered in the negative. "Oh, well, then we're twice lucky. A wound from its teeth or horn poisons a body. It doesn't bring death but madness. I know no antidote for the venom. The most merciful thing that can be done is to kill the victim before he's turned into a raving maniac." Elfane asked. He had to. "What other monsters live in this place?" There's the woolly spider, whose bite will cause a limb to blacken and fall off of a body before you can say, 'Tickle my toes.' Well, then there's the ear bats, so called because they emit a sound that causes the brain to swell and explode the skull, and, well, the night lizards that feed on the woolly spiders, although they attack people any chance they get. Oh, and of course, you can't forget the crotch crickets." "That's enough!" Brishee's voice was full of authority. "Run a rope from saddle to saddle. We must not lose anyone in this fog." When they were all tied to the lifeline, they proceeded under Cruith's direction toward the village. They made up one long snake of people and horses. The fog swept over them. Percy staggered to the top of the ridge. Yeah, I guess not enough threat. He had heard but not seen the battle with the snakes. The wild screams had made him shiver. With an odd mixture of fear and delight, he peered into the fog, which had by now reached the bottom of the ravine. He could not see if any of the party had fallen or if any of them had survived. He silently cursed the rolling fog for masking the results of the fight. Slowly, quietly, he crept to the bottom and began to search for bodies, hoping Larry's would be the first one he came upon. With his hands, Percy could discern where the muck had been disturbed, but he found no horses or humans. He touched the body of the snake that had surprised Brishee. Ew. It took him several minutes to decide that it was in fact the body of a huge snake. As the realization struck him, he was filled with a horror so great that he couldn't move. Gradually, he got his reasoning powers back and decided that if the thing were still alive, it would have attacked him by now. Revolted, but determined, he followed the length of the creature with his hands. If there were a man-shaped bulge in the creature, an autopsy was in order. He discovered the wounds inflicted by Larry and assumed that they were what had killed it. He felt his way forward to the bloody end of the beast. Here the muck was much churned up, and he thought for sure there was at least one of the party must have been killed. He groped through the muck as he moved forward. For a moment, he lost his sense of direction and panicked. Shuffling rapidly around in circles, he slipped on the hillside and fell forward instinctively, his hands stretched out before him to break his fall. The snake's dead head lay right under his right hand, and its horn neatly pierced his palm. Percy screamed, thinking he'd been bitten. He freed his hand and scrambled to the top of the ridge and out of the muck. He lay panting and holding his wounded hand. He didn't feel that he had it in him to go on, and yet he couldn't face going back through that slime. He found a bit of clean cloth in his saddlebags and bound his wound, and then, with all the courage he could muster, he located the tracks left by the party through touch, and resumed his covert mission. And I think that's where we're going to stop. It isn't quite where I wanted to get to, but it's close enough. The slime snakes have attacked.